Welcome to Dialogue. We're continuing our series on dirty politics, and today we're diving into another real-world documented example. It's all about how statecraft can use persuasion, filtering, really the engineering of public perception to get what it wants. And our focus today is Case 7. It discusses the claims around Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, the ultimate justification that led to the 2003 U.S.-led invasion. And our mission here isn't just to rehash history. I think we all know how it ended. It's to really look past the hindsight and dissect the mechanism. Because the paper trail shows this wasn't about one rogue agent or a single simple lie. It was about a whole system that learned how to speak with absolute confidence while being profoundly wrong.
And finding that institutional confidence was a much stronger catalyst for action than, say, verifiable accuracy.
Exactly. The failure here, when you really study it, was one of orchestrated presentations. It was about political filtering, not a failure of secrecy.
And what makes this case such a foundational example of dirty politics is, it's just the sheer power of institutional authority to manufacture inevitability. This deep dive really shows how ambiguous intelligence, we're talking about intelligence that was riddled with internal caveats, with known flaws, with strong dissent, and it was transformed into this irresistible narrative. They did it through selective emphasis, picking only the facts that fit their conclusion, and by leveraging these powerful brands, the CIA, the Pentagon, the State Department.
And with that, they engineered consent.
They engineered consent for a pre-planned military operation. I mean, it is the textbook definition of how political certainty can be weaponized to just outrun and eventually crush factual verification.
Okay, let's unpack that because the context really is everything here. We have to the political environment at the time without understanding that kind of fever pitch. None of the mechanisms that follow really make sense.
You're in post-9/11 America. It's a nation just steeped in this pervasive ambient fear. The whole psychological landscape had changed.
People were looking for answers.
They were craving a definitive response to what felt like an existential threat. And so you see this temporary but dramatic surge in trust in government institutions. People desperately wanted protection, clarity, and above all, a clear target for all that anxiety.
And that urgency just changes the equation.
It completely replaces patience. It replaces critical skepticism. It replaces the years-long process you usually need for sober verification of complex intelligence.
That's the critical factor, because in almost every other major justification for war, you have a direct attack, a Pearl Harbor, something tangible that demands a response.
A smoking gun.
Right. But Iraq didn't attack the U.S. leading up to 2003. They weren't the immediate aggressor.
Correct. So the inherent difficulty for the administration was that exact absence of a smoking gun. You couldn't just point to an ongoing threat. You had to meticulously build one. You had to present a potential threat as so overwhelming, so urgent, that everyone, policymakers, the public, the international community, felt that inaction wasn't just risky, it was suicidal.
So the policy window was open for regime change, but the public justification wasn't there yet.
And that's where the dirty politics maneuver begins. If you wait for the evidence to materialize, you risk losing that political moment.
You lose the momentum.
Exactly. Therefore, certainty becomes politically required before the evidence to support it actually exists. The political objectives drove the need for the intelligence, not the other way around.
And those objectives were incredibly ambitious. It wasn't just about disarming Saddam Hussein of whatever he might have had left over from the 90s.
Oh no, it was much bigger. There were three primary objectives. First, the very clear stated goal of regime change, getting Saddam Hussein out of power. Second, achieving strategic dominance in the Middle East, fundamentally reshaping the political map. And third, it was a global message, a potent demonstration of deterrence to any other nation thinking about developing WMDs.
So if those are your goals, the WMD threat becomes the key. It's the only thing that unlocks the ability to move forward without massive international backlash or dissent at home.
Absolutely. Without the existential threat of WMDs and that implied threat of them falling into the hands of terrorists, the argument for a preemptive war just collapses.
The threat had to feel massive, immediate.
Incredible. And they delivered this through a campaign of just repeated, non-cautious assertions that completely saturated the public discourse. These weren't presented as possibilities or probabilities. They were presented as absolute facts.
Okay, let's break down those specific claims. What were the three pillars of this threat they were building?
Well, they leveraged a mix of known history and future speculation. The first pillar was that Iraq possessed chemical weapons stockpiles.
Which had some historical weight.
It did. Saddam had used them before. which lent this dark credibility to the claim. The second was that Iraq was actively pursuing biological weapons, and that carries this enormous psychological fear factor.
And the third piece?
The third was that Iraq was actively, aggressively reconstituting a nuclear program. So you put all three together, and you're painting a picture of a mad dictator on the verge of acquiring world-changing power. It demands intervention.
But the claim that did the most political heavy lifting, the one that really drove home the urgency, was that Iraq could deploy these weapons within, what was it?
45 minutes.
45 minutes. That specific timeline turned a long-term strategic threat into an immediate crisis.
That 45-minute number is a masterclass in narrative structuring. It's concise, it's terrifying, and it implies a capability that completely bypasses any window for diplomacy or debate.
By the time you finish verifying the claim, the attack could already be underway.
Precisely. It allows the argument to shift from Saddam is a risk to Saddam requires emergency action now.
It eliminates any other option. And these claims weren't just in some internal memo. They were everywhere.
Systematically integrated. They were in presidential speeches, weekly radio addresses. They were the bedrock of intelligence briefings to Congress. They drove media headlines, repeated uncritically because of the authority of the source.
And it all culminated in one moment, the centerpiece that codified this manufactured certainty for the whole world.
Secretary of State Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations Security Council, February 2003.
That was the ultimate act of political theater. It was designed to convince a very skeptical global audience that the intelligence was unassailable.
And they used Colin Powell, a figure of immense credibility, to deliver what was framed as this sober, definitive assessment. He was leveraging his personal authority to validate the entire campaign.
So if the first part was the why the threat was necessary, this next part is about the how. How did the intelligence community, which is designed for skepticism, become a participant in this?
This is where we shift from political maneuvering to institutional process failure. Intelligence, which should be this detached process of analysis and skepticism, was transformed into a product.
A product.
A custom-made product for a specific customer, the policymaker who needed justification for war. The goal shifted from finding the truth to supplying the needed conclusion. And when intelligence becomes a product, well, quality control disappears. That's dirty politics lesson number 1.
I find that chilling. But let's push back a bit. How do we know this was active filtering and not just, I don't know, massive incompetence under pressure? Where's the line?
The line is drawn where internal verified dissent was systematically ignored, suppressed, or bypassed. The evidence shows it wasn't just poor analysis, it was the active elevation of weak data and the simultaneous suppression of contradictory data.
And the most infamous example of that is the case of Curveball.
Curveball, the single defector whose claims became central to the entire biological weapons case.
So who was he?
His real name was Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi, an Iraqi chemical engineer who defected to Germany. And his whole story rests on claims about mobile biological weapons labs.
Trucks and trains.
Exactly. Things that could produce anthrax on the move, making them impossible to detect by satellite. A very compelling idea if you're looking for elusive evidence.
But the crucial fact, the one that should have disqualified him completely, was that his information could not be verified.
Not only could it not be verified, but the German intelligence service, the BND, had serious, sustained doubts about him. They internally labeled him unstable, reported his claims were likely fabricated, and that his motivations were self-serving.
And they passed these warnings on to U.S. intelligence.
They did. So U.S. intelligence knew the source was flagged as unreliable, maybe mentally unstable, and his core claim had zero corroboration. And yet, his claims became the central, most alarming part of the biological weapons case presented to the world.
Why? Why use him if he was so clearly flawed?
Because his claim perfectly fit the narrative. Mobile labs explain why U.S. surveillance couldn't find the labs they knew had to be there. He was a single-source solution to an impossible evidence problem.
And Curveball wasn't the only failure. Let's talk about the systemic suppression of skepticism, the cherry picking.
This is key. It wasn't always some dramatic burning of a memo. It was often just organizational filtering. Dissenting intelligence reports saying, wait, this source is bad or this evidence is benign was downplayed. It was literally buried, put in the footnotes of these dense, multi-hundred-page intelligence estimates that, decision makers don't have time to read fully.
So the executive summary, the 1 or 2 pager the president actually reads, was already curated. It was cleaned up to remove the doubt.
Precisely. Dissenting views, especially from the State Department's own intelligence wing, which was very skeptical, were minimized or excluded from those high-level summaries. So if the policymaker only sees the synthesis, and the synthesis is only the most alarming parts, that assertion hardens into fact almost immediately.
And a perfect example of that filtering was the whole controversy around the aluminum tubes.
Oh, absolutely. The aluminum tubes became the central proof that Iraq was reconstituting its nuclear program. The claim was that these were specialized, high-strength tubes that could only be used for centrifuges to enrich uranium.
But there was a strong counter-argument right away, wasn't there?
A very significant one, mainly from the Department of Energy and State Department intelligence. Their analysts argued the dimensions, the thickness. Everything about those tubes was far more consistent with conventional artillery rockets. They were too heavy and too thick for the precise needs of centrifuges.
So you have two camps. One says nuclear threat, the other says conventional rockets. How did the filtering work there?
The mechanism elevated the highest threat possibility, the nuclear one, and sidelined the more plausible one. The information was presented to the public and decision makers without the necessary caveats.
So when Powell gave his presentation,
He framed the tubes solely in the context of nuclear weapons. He called them high-strength aluminum tubes, which are banned by multiple UN resolutions. That wording reinforces the conclusion while completely excluding the dissent. That's not incompetence. That's a policy choice.
and if the traditional channels, like the CIA, were too slow or too rigorous, the administration found alternatives. This is where parallel intelligence channels come in.
A textbook maneuver. An office was set up specifically to bypass standard setting. The most famous example was the Office of Special Plans, or OSP, inside the Pentagon.
What was its job?
Its function was to re-examine raw intelligence that the established community, like the CIA or DIA, had already dismissed as unreliable. They were basically hunting for the smoking gun that the main agencies couldn't find.
So they weren't interested in cross-verification. They were interested in confirmation.
Exactly. They were an echo chamber. They sought out information that confirmed the desired narrative and ignored anything that contradicted it. It created this closed loop where the policy dictated the intelligence.
So once that filtered, confident intelligence product was created, the next step was to make it politically irresistible. This is where the media comes in.
The media's role was defined by amplification without friction. In that post-9/11 atmosphere, major outlets frequently just repeated official claims verbatim. They relied heavily on anonymous, high-ranking officials who were pushing the narrative.
And skepticism, which is supposed to be the core of journalism, was often framed as unpatriotic.
It was a very effective feedback loop. Officials release claims, the media repeats them, the public believes them, and that public consensus reinforces the officials' confidence. It meant that a few crucial questions were almost never asked.
What were those questions?
Simple, foundational questions. Who benefits from a narrative of immediate war? What information is actively disputed inside the intelligence community? And, most simply, what is genuinely not known?
But asking those questions required caution, and caution was made to look like weakness.
If you can successfully make doubt look like disloyalty, verification becomes optional. The urgency of that 45-minute claim made asking for more proof seem frivolous, even dangerous.
The focus shifted from the content of the intelligence to the character of the messenger.
Exactly. If the Secretary of State, backed by the President, speaks with absolute confidence, challenging them becomes politically costly.
Which brings us back to the climax of this whole campaign. The theatrical proof delivered by Colin Powell at the UN.
It was a highly managed performance. The goal wasn't to present raw data. It was to overwhelm the senses with technical jargon and visual evidence that conveyed unassailable certainty.
And he used props.
Powerful visual cues. High-resolution satellite images suggesting omniscience. They played redacted audio intercepts, which makes you feel like you're listening in on a secret plot.
And then there was the physical prop, the vial.
The vial. He held up a model and said, "Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax. That is enough to kill thousands." It wasn't real, but that act of holding a tangible object that represents massive danger was a profound visual metaphor.
It substitutes an abstract threat for something small and real right there in the room.
And the core achievement was that the messenger's confidence, combined with the theatrical display, was explicitly substituted for verifiable proof. He was saying, "Trust my authority. Trust my certainty."
It was a PowerPoint dressed as inevitability.
It was. And while it failed to get a UN mandate, it successfully solidified the domestic narrative and framed the conflict as unstoppable.
So the invasion happens, the regime falls, and the search begins. And almost immediately, the entire premise starts to unravel.
The collapse was total. The Iraq Survey Group, with thousands of analysts and troops, searched for months. No WMD stockpiles were found. No active programs were found. The entire basis for the urgency was just absent.
So the core claims were not just wrong, they were describing something that didn't exist in the form they claimed.
Precisely. Even the nuclear ambitions were confirmed to be grossly overstated. The aluminum tubes were, as the dissenting analysts had warned, for conventional rockets. The intelligence had failed catastrophically.
And what did the official investigations conclude about this?
They all aligned. First, the intelligence was fundamentally flawed, often based on single sources like curveball. Second, long-standing assumptions about Saddam had hardened into facts, regardless of new data.
And the third conclusion?
The most damning one, that internal warnings, the red flags raised by skeptics, were systematically ignored, downplayed, or bypassed by those seeking a specific policy outcome. The Silberman-Robb Commission noted that analysts felt intense pressure to support the war justification.
And yet, despite the monumental scale of being wrong, nobody was prosecuted for misleading the public or manipulating intelligence.
And that takes us back to why this is dirty politics, not just an intelligence mistake. Being factually wrong was not considered the primary failure by the system. The failure in their eyes would have been not achieving the policy goal.
So the data wasn't just fabricated from thin air.
No, and that's a key nuance. The available data was treated in 4 specific ways. It was selective, picking only the highest threat interpretations. It was amplified, making tiny possibilities sound like certainties. It was overconfident, removing all the caveats, and it was politically filtered.
Which gives us dirty politics lesson number 2. You don't need fake data. You just need selective certainty.
Exactly. It provides that crucial layer of plausible deniability. It lets officials claim we relied on the best intelligence available, even when they knew that intelligence was highly disputed.
And the human and geopolitical consequences of this process, they were just staggering. Hundreds of thousands killed, trillions of dollars, regional destabilization that fueled new terror groups, and a massive erosion of institutional trust.
The irony is that the corrections did eventually come. Reports were written, hearings were held, apologies were offered.
But they all came years too late. None of those apologies or reports reversed the outcome.
The objective was achieved by moving the policy forward faster than doubt could catch up. Once the war is initiated, the actual facts become historical footnotes that, critically, cannot stop a war already in motion.
And this connects back to what we've seen before in this series. With Northwoods, we saw how justifications could be proposed internally. With the Naira testimony, we saw how raw emotion could be weaponized.
And the Iraq WMD case shows the final evolution of that. How disputed, uncertain intelligence can be systematically laundered into inevitability through institutional filtering. They're all different tools, but the objective is the same: engineering consent.
So what's the final lesson here?
It's a brutal and relevant lesson. When political urgency replaces rigorous verification, and when authority, that podium at the UN, that presidential seal, replaces verifiable evidence, truth becomes merely cosmetic. The entire objective of dirty politics is achieved the moment certainty outruns doubt. And that's the mechanism you always have to look out for.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.